At my own family's charity gala, my brother-in-law stood before 500 of the most powerful figures in Atlanta's elite and handed me a cheap plastic alarm clock. He wore the perfect smile of a predator and boldly declared to the entire hall that my mind had deteriorated and that he would be taking over my entire empire. I did not shout. I did not throw a punch. I simply accepted the clock sat down and quietly activated a protocol that would send him straight to federal prison. Before I tell you how a single signature destroyed his entire life, tell me which city you're watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you've ever had to smile in front of a family member who secretly wanted to see you buried. My name is Elias Sterling. I am 72 years old. Last night was supposed to honor the contributions of the Sterling Foundation to the community. The ballroom was filled with glittering crystal lights, the soft clinking of champagne glasses, and smooth jazz floating through the air. The 500 guests present were financial sharks, seasoned politicians, and some of the most powerful tycoons in America. I sat quietly at the center table observing everything. Since suffering a mild stroke last year, I've had to walk with a cane and move a little slower. That's why they began looking at me with pity. But the most pitiful, most artificial sympathy came from my own family. Donovan Pierce, my 55-year-old brother-in-law, husband of my late sister. He stepped onto the stage wearing an expensive Tom Ford suit, his hair slicked back perfectly, a Rolex gleaming under the lights. He tapped the microphone. The entire hall fell silent. Donovan began his speech in a deep, warm voice, pretending to be sympathetic. He spoke about my achievements, about how I built the Sterling Foundation from nothing. But then his voice softened. He looked straight into my eyes with unmistakable triumph. He announced that I, Elias Sterling, had been diagnosed with dementia. He declared that starting tonight, due to my health condition, he would officially assume the position of chairman of the Sterling Foundation. Whispers spread across the ballroom. Eyes turned toward me, curious, probing, filled with pity. Donovan stepped down from the stage and walked directly to my table. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a cheap plastic alarm clock, the kind you could buy in any grocery store. He placed it in front of me beside my glass of red wine. Then he patted my shoulder and said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "It's time for you to go to bed, Elias. Leave the hard work to the younger generation." He smiled, a smile of absolute betrayal. He thought I was a senile old man, a man drained of strength and incapable of resistance. What he didn't know was that the very moment he placed that clock on the table, the death sentence for his future had already been signed. They looked at my white hair and my wooden cane and believed they had the right to judge me. They thought I was a lamb waiting to be led to slaughter. But they had forgotten who I was. 40 years ago, I wasn't a privileged heir born with a silver spoon. I was a black man who clawed his way out of the harshest slums, chewing up the most ruthless sharks on Wall Street to build this empire. I crushed corrupt labor unions, defeated the most formidable rivals, and constructed a network of power so deep that even the authorities treated it with caution. I never slept. Even when my eyes were closed, my mind was calculating the next move. I knew exactly what kind of man Donovan was. Just a flashy financial broker addicted to social media bragging, using my family's money to build his hollow image of high society. He thought bribing a few doctors to obtain a fake medical certificate was the perfect plan. He thought holding surface-level authority would make him king. But real power doesn't lie in the chairman's seat or in applause at a gala. Real power lies in silence. The silence of an old lion who has learned how to hunt without making a sound. I sat there and looked straight into Donovan's eyes. I wasn't angry. I simply felt a deep pity for his stupidity. When you build a fortress with your own blood and sweat, You know every brick, every hidden corridor, every trap. The Sterling Foundation is not a company. It is a meat-grinding machine designed by my own hands. And Donovan had just willingly stepped inside it. He thought he was stealing my wealth. In reality, he was tightening the noose around his own neck. I calmly picked up the plastic clock, nodded to him, and signaled my driver to take me away from the party. As I walked through the grand doors, leaving behind the noise and the watching eyes, I knew the purge had begun. Which city are you watching this video from? Hit the like button right now if you've ever been stabbed in the back by your own family because of greed. We are often taught that family is sacred, that it is the place we return to. But sometimes the most dangerous wolves are the ones who share your blood or sit at the same dinner table. The deepest betrayal never comes from enemies because you expect it from them. It comes from the people you trust the most, the ones you protected and lifted up. Donovan was one of those people. He exploited the compassion I had for my late sister to climb into his current position. He mistook my silence for surrender. But real men do not respond with shouting. We respond with the coldest and most decisive actions. Trust is a luxury currency, and I stopped spending it on parasites long ago. Never allow anyone's family or stranger to trample on the legacy you spent your entire life building. Tell me your story in the comments below. Have you ever had to confront a toxic parasite inside your own family? What did you do to protect what belonged to you? Leave a comment. I read every one of your stories. This battle is not mine alone. It is the battle of every man who fights daily to protect his family from opportunists. The next morning, the sky over Atlanta was gray and cold. I stepped through the automatic glass doors of the most exclusive private hospital in the city. This place did not smell of cheap disinfectant or echo with loud crying. Instead, it carried the scent of expensive machine-brewed coffee and the quiet calm of privilege. I walked across the polished marble floor with my cane. Each tap of the wooden tip against the stone echoed sharply through the hallway. I wasn't here for my own health. I was here for Calvin. Calvin has been my brother in arms since the earliest days of my career. More than 40 years ago, when I had nothing but 2 empty hands and a head full of ambition, Calvin stepped in front of me when dockyard enforcers tried to break my legs. Now Calvin lay in the intensive care unit. He needed a heart surgery costing $200,000. His insurance refused to cover it. But that didn't matter. To me, loyalty is a debt that never expires. I walked straight to the payment counter in the hospital's VIP services area. The receptionist looked up at me and recognized me immediately. Anyone working in this upper-class district knew the name Elias Sterling. She gave a professional smile and asked how she could help. In a calm voice, I told her I wanted to pay the full cost of surgery and post-operative care for patient Calvin in room 3. She typed rapidly on the keyboard for a moment before informing me that the total came to $215,000. I didn't blink. I reached into the inside pocket of my suit and pulled out my solid black card. An American Express Centurion card made of titanium. It was heavier than any other credit card. When I placed it on the marble counter, it landed with a sharp, metallic click that carried undeniable authority. This card had no spending limit. It was directly connected to the cash flow of the Sterling Foundation. It was a symbol of absolute power in the financial world. The receptionist picked up the card with both hands, clearly respectful. She inserted it into the chip reader. I stood there waiting, listening to the soft, instrumental music flowing from the ceiling speakers. But instead of the familiar confirmation beep of a successful transaction, I heard a harsh error tone. The girl's expression changed slightly. She removed the card, gently wiped the chip, and inserted it again. Another error beep. Her fingers moved faster across the keyboard as her eyes fixed on the monitor. I noticed a small bead of sweat rolling down her temple. No one wants to deliver bad news to a man who controls a massive investment fund. She looked up and forced an apologetic smile, explaining that the system might be experiencing a network issue, and asked if she could try again by swiping the magnetic strip. I nodded calmly. The third attempt produced a longer, more piercing error sound. A bright red message appeared on her screen. Transaction declined. The receptionist swallowed nervously. She looked at me again. The respect in her eyes had shifted into confusion and a trace of pity. She spoke very quietly, almost whispering, so others wouldn't hear. "Mr. Sterling, your card has been locked." She continued, explaining that the system indicated the issue wasn't insufficient funds. The account had been frozen under an emergency behavioral restriction order. Her words hit me like a bucket of ice water. Locked. Frozen. Behavioral restriction order. Those words had never existed in my world for 40 years. This card was the financial lifeline of an empire. To freeze it required legal authority stronger than my own personal control. In a fraction of a second, I understood exactly what had happened. The image of my brother-in-law Donovan smiling triumphantly the night before flashed through my mind. He had handed me that cheap alarm clock at the Gala. I thought it was merely a public humiliation meant to clear the path to the chairman's seat. But I had underestimated his cunning. That clock was only bait. While I sat quietly during the party, Donovan had moved behind my back and severed the main artery of the Sterling Empire. He didn't just want prestige. He wanted complete control. And to achieve that, he needed to legally declare me mentally incompetent. The receptionist's sympathetic gaze was still fixed on me. People nearby had begun to notice. An elegantly dressed elderly black man who apparently couldn't even pay a hospital bill. Humiliation began to seep into the air. Donovan had calculated this move carefully. He wanted me to stand here in public and realize I had lost everything. He wanted me to explode with anger and demand to call my bank manager, proving that I was mentally unstable just as he had claimed. But Donovan forgot one simple rule. Lions never roar when they begin the hunt. They roar only after their teeth are already buried in the prey's throat. I wasn't angry. A cold sensation ran down my spine, but it wasn't fear. It was focus, the kind that comes right before eliminating an enemy. I smiled warmly at the receptionist to reassure her. I told her there must be a small misunderstanding with the accounting department and that I would resolve it immediately. I reached forward and took back the black card. The titanium felt cold, now useless, like a scrap of metal. I slipped it back into my jacket, but I didn't turn around and walk away. Instead, I pulled out a backup personal checkbook linked to a discreet account at a small out-of-state bank that their system hadn't touched yet. I wrote a check for $215,000, signed it, and placed it on the counter. I told her to use that payment to ensure Calvin received surgery immediately. She accepted the check, still confused, but nodding. I turned and walked out of the payment area, leaning on my cane. The sound of the wooden tip striking the marble floor now echoed like the ticking of a countdown timer. Donovan had made a fatal mistake. He believed freezing my credit card meant stripping away my power. What he didn't understand was that my true wealth had never lived in the numbers of a central bank. My real assets were buried secrets, encrypted contracts, and networks of shadow power that a shallow man like him could never reach. By using Calvin's life, my brother, as a tool in his scheme, he hadn't merely challenged me. He had signed his own death sentence. I stepped outside into the cold Atlanta air. The wind struck my face, but I didn't feel the cold. This game was no longer about protecting my fortune. This was a purge, and I was going to show my brother-in-law exactly how ruthless a predator can be when it once sat at the very top of the food chain. I stepped out of the hospital, leaving behind the sterile white lights and the steady beeping of medical machines. The cold air of Atlanta cut against my skin, but my mind was far colder than that. I signaled my driver to step back and opened the car door myself. I wanted to drive. The feel of the leather-wrapped steering wheel beneath my rough fingers helped reconnect me to reality. The engine started with a deep, low growl, the sound of old power that never goes out of style. I closed the door, sealing myself inside a space of absolute silence. This was my first defensive line. I picked up my phone, connected it to the car's sound system, and dialed the direct priority line of the investment bank. I wasn't calling an ordinary customer service agent. I called the senior asset manager who had handled billions of dollars flowing through the Sterling Foundation for the past 15 years. The phone rang twice before someone answered. Normally, he would greet me with enthusiasm and respect, but today there was only a tense silence on the other end. A hesitant breath. Then he spoke in a low, strained voice. He called me Mr. Sterling, but the way he said my name sounded as if he were speaking to a dead man. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I asked directly why my solid black card had been declined at the hospital payment desk. I asked who possessed enough authority to override my biometric access and freeze the central accounts. The man hesitated. I could hear him swallow. Mr. Sterling. I'm truly sorry, he said. But we had no choice. The bank's legal department was required to freeze everything at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. I asked him on what legal basis. His voice trembled as he read the words appearing on his computer screen. An emergency medical power of attorney. He explained that a team of lawyers representing Donovan Pierce had arrived at the bank headquarters the moment the doors opened. They brought a thick medical file and a temporary court order. The document had been signed by my own private physician. The same doctor I had paid hundreds of thousands of dollars every year to oversee my health. The document stated, using specialized medical terminology, that I had completely lost my civil capacity. It declared that I was in the late stages of dementia with severe paranoia and was no longer capable of making any financial or medical decisions. And because I had no living spouse, the section designating legal guardian listed a single name. Donovan Pierce, my respected brother-in-law. I sat motionless in the driver's seat. The engine was still running, but the world around me seemed to stop turning. My doctor had been bought. He had sold me out for whatever number Donovan promised him. My brother-in-law didn't just want my money. He wanted to erase my legal existence. In the eyes of American law, I was no longer Elias Sterling, the powerful chairman who had acquired dozens of major companies. I was now an empty shell, a confused old man who needed to be spoon-fed and have his diapers changed. Everything I owned now rested in Donovan's hands. The bank manager continued speaking. The freeze applied to every personal account, every stock portfolio, and every trust fund connected to my Social Security number. Donovan now had full authority to decide every dollar I was allowed to spend. Manipulating the system is an art that Donovan believed he had mastered. He thought bribing a debt-ridden doctor was enough to overthrow an empire. What he failed to understand is that in the world of high power, money can buy paperwork, but it can never buy absolute loyalty. He saw only the numbers floating on the surface of tax documents. He had no idea about the hidden agreements I had established 30 years ago to protect this family from parasites disguised as relatives. When he signed his name as legal guardian, he believed he was receiving the key to an endless treasure vault. In reality, he had just signed a contract placing the highest level of legal liability for everything related to the foundation squarely on his own shoulders. Any other man my age hearing this news would have suffered a heart attack. They would scream into the phone. They would slam their fists against the steering wheel, curse the injustice of life, and threaten to drag the bank to the Supreme Court. But I did none of that. I learned long ago, during the years I fought my way up from the bottom of society, that panic is the scent of blood that attracts sharks. I leaned back in the seat, closed my eyes, and took a deep breath. Then I spoke to the bank manager in a voice so calm that it made him shiver. I told him everything had been noted. Let the bank's legal department do their job, and under no circumstances should he attempt to interfere. He seemed unable to believe what he was hearing. He stammered, asking whether he should call the police. I told him no. Do not call anyone. I ended the call. Silence once again filled the car. Donovan had played a very large hand. He had used America's medical and legal systems designed to protect the elderly, as weapons to imprison me. He believed that by locking the front door of the Sterling Foundation, he had become the sole owner of the house. What he didn't understand was that the architecture of real power never lives on pieces of paper lawyers present to judges. Some accounts have never carried my name. Some streams of money have never passed through the traditional banking system. And some destruction protocols activate only when I appear to bow my head. They had pushed me into the darkness, but they forgot something. Darkness is where I was born and where I was raised. A lion never needs permission to be a lion. I shifted the car into gear and pressed the accelerator. The vehicle shot forward onto the highway, heading straight toward my mansion. It was time to see what the rats were doing inside my territory. The car rolled onto the tree-lined road leading to my mansion on the outskirts of Atlanta. The handcrafted iron gate that was always kept closed now stood wide open. 3 black SUVs were parked arrogantly on my carefully trimmed lawn. Tire marks had torn through the grass that my wife Sarah used to tend herself every weekend. The familiar silence of the house had been shattered by crude laughter and the heavy thudding of footsteps on the expensive oak floors. I pushed the door open, and the violation struck me instantly. My home, the fortress I had built with sweat and blood, now looked like a crime scene being looted. Leaning on my cane, I walked slowly down the hallway toward Sarah's reading room. That room had once been the most sacred place in this house, a space that preserved the entire soul of our family. When I arrived, the sight before me made the blood in my veins freeze. 2 large men wearing cheap suits stood in the middle of the room. They were Donovan's bodyguards, street thugs dressed in the costume of professional security. One of them held a mahogany box containing our family photo albums and the love letters I had written to Sarah 40 years ago. The other held a large black garbage bag. He chuckled mockingly and said in a sneering voice, "Let's clean up this old woman's trash." The boss says he wants this room turned into a cigar lounge. We'll put a pool table right in the middle. The other man shrugged. Then he tipped the wooden box upside down. Photographs as memories, priceless fragments of my late wife's life, spilled into the filthy garbage bag. The glass frame of our wedding photo shattered on the floor with a painful crack. Any other man witnessing that scene would have charged forward to fight them. They would shout, swing fists, grab a stick, anything to defend the honor of their dead wife. The primal instinct inside me roared to tear those 2 men apart where they stood. I wanted to crush their throats for daring to lay their filthy hands on Sarah's belongings. But the mind of an experienced predator restrained the beast within me. I knew this was a trap. Donovan was not only greedy, he was cunning. He had deliberately ordered his men to ransack Sarah's belongings the moment I returned. He wanted me to lose control, He wanted me to attack his guards so they could call the police. An elderly man with dementia assaulting people inside his own home. That would be the final piece he needed to seal the medical record, proving I was a dangerous lunatic, and lock me away in a psychiatric institution forever. I leaned against the doorway and looked at the two bodyguards with an empty, icy gaze. The man holding the garbage bag noticed me. He smirked provocatively, spreading his arms as if waiting for me to explode and attack him. But I said nothing. I did not let them see a single tear or even a wrinkle of anger. I simply smiled. A faint, razor-thin smile crossed my face, then disappeared. I nodded calmly to them, turned my back and walked away, leaving clear disappointment on their faces. They thought they were destroying my world. What they didn't know was that they had just signed the death warrant of their employer. I walked down the hallway, leaving the sounds of destruction behind, and headed straight to the basement garage. The air there was thick with the smell of engine oil and burnt rubber. Flickering fluorescent lights illuminated my collection of classic cars. But I wasn't here to admire them, nor was I looking for a vehicle to escape. I walked to the darkest corner of the garage where a massive steel tool cabinet stood weighing hundreds of pounds and covered in dust. With one decisive motion, I reached behind the cabinet and pressed firmly on a hidden fake screw beneath its base. A concealed hydraulic motor hissed softly. The enormous steel cabinet slowly slid aside, revealing a flawless concrete wall. At the center of the wall, a small panel slid open, exposing a retinal scanner and a military-grade fingerprint recognition pad. I removed my leather glove, pressed my thumb onto the glass, and stared into the glowing red electronic eye. The system scanned and verified the genetic signature and heartbeat of the Supreme Founder. A heavy metallic click echoed from deep underground. A 10-inch thick titanium steel door, the kind of security technology normally found only in Federal Reserve vaults, slowly opened. Cold air spilled outward. I stepped inside and the lights turned on automatically. Inside this bunker there was no cash, no gold bars, no diamonds. Those things are too ordinary for a real empire. Instead, rows of fireproof steel cabinets lined the walls holding the darkest files imaginable. This was where the deadliest contracts were kept, where off-ledger records that would never appear in accounting books were stored, where secrets capable of burying the entire elite of Atlanta slept quietly. And inside the very first cabinet sat a file labeled Project Black Seed. Within it lay the full evidence of my brother-in-law Donovan's money laundering operation and his $150 million debt. They believed they had invaded my sacred world above ground. What they didn't realize was that I had just stepped into the control center, and I was about to open the gates of hell that would swallow their entire lives. The lion had returned to his den, and the hunt had officially begun. A sudden downpour fell over the city of Atlanta, tapping cold rhythms against the glass roof of my car. I had just driven away from the mansion, leaving behind the wreckage Donovan's men had created. I wasn't heading to a lawyer's office or the police station. Those places are for weak men who rely on the surface layer of the legal system for protection. Instead, I drove to a small rundown diner hidden behind an abandoned industrial park on the outskirts of the city. The diner didn't even have a proper name, just a half-burned red neon sign flickering in the night. There were no luxury cars parked outside, only a few rusted pickup trucks belonging to night shift workers. This was where the city's dirtiest secrets were traded in silence. I pushed the door open. The smell of burnt grease and reheated coffee hit my nose instantly. The doorbell rang with a dry, metallic chime. I walked straight to the darkest corner of the diner, where the weak ceiling light barely reached. Sitting there was Tyson. He was a tall black man, with a long scar running from his ear down to the collar of his shirt. 30 years ago, we had fought side by side in the most dangerous slums of the South. Later, Tyson joined the FBI and became one of their best undercover agents specializing in dismantling major financial crime networks. He was retired now, but his intelligence network never slept. When I called him that morning, I said only one sentence: "I need everything you have on Donovan Pierce." Tyson was sipping black coffee. He didn't look up when I sat down on the torn booth seat across from him. Instead, he silently slid a thick brown file across the table. The hand of a former federal agent was steady and heavy with purpose. Tyson spoke quietly. "Elias, you're dealing with something a lot uglier than you think." I opened the file. Inside were not shopping receipts or cheap scandal photos. There were encrypted bank statements, surveillance images taken from hidden cameras at a private dock, and international transfer records tied to shell companies that couldn't be traced. Tyson looked me directly in the eyes and began dissecting the situation in a cold voice. "Donovan isn't just some flashy brother-in-law who likes spending money and showing off," he said. "He didn't seize control of the Sterling Foundation just to buy more supercars or throw wild parties. He's gambling with his life." According to Tyson's investigation over the past 2 years, Donovan had secretly become involved in a cryptocurrency gambling network on the dark web. He believed he was a financial genius who could outsmart the system. But he didn't realize the system was run by an extremely violent money laundering syndicate based in Miami. These weren't street-level gangsters. They were a transnational crime organization that used cryptocurrency transactions to legalize billions of dollars from illegal operations. Donovan borrowed heavily from them using extreme financial leverage in hopes of doubling his money and expanding his image of power. But the digital market collapsed, and he lost everything. The amount he owed the Miami syndicate wasn't $1 or $2 million. He owed them $150 million of dirty money. I paused. My eyes locked onto the terrifying number circled in red on the final transaction receipt. $150 million. This was no longer a simple family dispute over wealth. This was a ticking bomb capable of destroying everything I had built. Tyson continued. The Miami syndicate had issued Donovan an ultimatum. They gave him exactly 1 week to repay the full amount. If he failed, they wouldn't just kill him. They would do far worse before they did, and afterward, they would hunt down his relatives to collect the debt. That was why Donovan had acted so desperately and recklessly. He had used the last of his money to bribe my doctor into forging medical records and freezing my accounts. He needed $150 million from the Sterling Foundation to save his worthless life, and he didn't care who he had to step on to get it. I leaned back in the booth, letting the information settle into my mind, which was now running calculations at maximum speed. Now everything made perfect sense. His arrogance, his ruthless decision to strip me of power during the gala the night before. It wasn't the confidence of a winner. It was the panic of an animal trapped in a corner. He believed that if he could seize control of the Sterling Foundation, he could use his legal guardianship to transfer $150 million to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands for the Miami syndicate. He intended to use my blood to wash away his sins. He intended to turn my financial empire into a laundering station for criminals. Tyson drained the last of his coffee and set the cup down hard on the table. "Elias," he said, "the Miami people aren't joking. They've already sent serious men to Atlanta to track Donovan's every move. The guys in your house throwing your wife's belongings into trash bags. They're not just cheap bodyguards. They're Miami syndicate enforcers placed there to make sure Donovan doesn't run before the money clears." He continued, "If you try to sue him and regain control, the legal process could take months. The Miami crew won't wait that long. They'll kill Donovan, And then they'll come for you because you're the obstacle preventing them from getting their money. Tyson advised me to contact a federal task force immediately and enter the witness protection program. This isn't just a financial chess match anymore, he said. You can't solve this alone. I sat quietly in the dark diner listening to the rain tapping softly against the window. Witness protection. Running away like a defeated man. Handing my legacy over to uniformed police officers and praying criminals wouldn't find me. That was the way of cowards. That was not the way of a lion who had ruled Atlanta's elite for 40 years. Donovan had brought hungry wolves to my door. He had turned the Sterling family into a pawn in a money laundering scheme. He thought I would be afraid. He thought I would retreat when faced with pressure from the underworld. But he didn't understand something. At 72 years old, the only thing I fear is dying without defending my family's honor. I closed the file and slipped it into my coat. Then I looked at Tyson and gave him a cold, quiet smile. I don't need police protection, I told him. The police clean up scenes after everything is over. I'm the one who creates the scene. Donovan needed $150 million to save his life. He wanted an investment fund. I would give him one. But it would be a steel cage packed with explosives designed specifically to bury him and anyone foolish enough to covet my wealth deep in hell. I thanked Tyson, left a $100 bill on the table, and walked out of the diner. The rain had stopped. The air felt sharper than ever. As I climbed into the car, I knew exactly what I had to do next. This war had moved far beyond greed. It had become a game of survival, and I had never been the man who loses bloody games. Atlanta remained wrapped in an eerie stillness after the rain. I was driving along an empty highway, my mind organizing the pieces from Tyson's file. $150 million. A money laundering syndicate in Miami. Donovan had tied himself to a block of concrete, and now he was trying to drag the entire Sterling family to the bottom of the ocean with him. I had just turned onto the road leading toward downtown when my phone vibrated. The short notification sound broke the silence inside the car. I glanced at the screen. It wasn't a number saved in my contacts. It was a string of digits masked by anonymous encryption software. The instinct of a man who had spent decades navigating the battlefield of business told me this wasn't spam. I pulled over, shifted the car into park, and picked up the phone. I opened the message. There was no greeting, only a photograph and a short line of text. The photo had been taken in bright daylight under the California sun. In the background was the familiar parking lot of the prestigious Stanford University campus, thousands of miles away from Atlanta. But the center of the image made my heart stop for a quarter of a second. It was Kendra, my 22-year-old granddaughter, the future of the Sterling family. Kendra was sitting behind the wheel of the car I had given her for her birthday last year. But her face wasn't wearing the radiant smile I knew so well. She was crying. Her eyes were wide with pure panic. Through the windshield, I could clearly see the reflection of two unfamiliar men, large, imposing figures, standing right beside the car door. One of them had his broad hand resting on the hood. Below the photograph was a single line of text. Sign the transfer papers or she will never graduate. It didn't take a detective to know who had sent that message. Donovan. My cowardly brother-in-law knew I had begun investigating. He understood he couldn't intimidate me with fake medical documents or frozen credit cards. He had realized that if he wanted to force an old lion to kneel, he had to strike the only vulnerable place that lion possessed. Kendra was my blood. The last living fragment of my late wife Sarah's soul. She was an exceptional student, who had never been exposed to the filthy shadows of the underworld. Donovan had sent Miami syndicate thugs all the way to California to intercept her. He was using the life and future of an innocent young woman as his final bargaining chip. In the world of powerful men, there is an unwritten boundary that no one is supposed to cross. You can insult me. You can try to steal my company. You can cheat me out of my money or even attempt to lock me in a retirement home. Those things are business. They are risks handled with lawyers' numbers on balance sheets and financial retaliation. But when you touch my family, when you use my granddaughter's life as a threat, the nature of the game changes completely. People often speak of the dragon's reverse scale, the one fatal weakness that also unleashes its most destructive fury. Donovan had just placed his hand on that scale. Any other grandfather seeing that photo would fall into panic immediately. They would call the police. They would call the university. They would beg the kidnappers and sign whatever papers were demanded to save their grandchild. But I sat in my car in absolute silence. My breathing was steady. My hands did not tremble. A wave of icy cold traveled down my spine and spread through my veins. It was not fear. It was rage at its purest form, not the kind that burns like fire, the kind that freezes into a blade of ice. Donovan believed that photograph would break my will. He believed he had found my pressure point. What he didn't realize was that he had just destroyed his final chance of survival. If before, I intended only to reclaim my assets and send him to prison. At that moment, I decided I would erase him from existence. I zoomed into the photo, examining every detail. The two men weren't holding weapons. They were simply applying psychological pressure. They were standing in a university parking lot in broad daylight. There would be dozens of security cameras and hundreds of students nearby. They wouldn't dare do anything violent, at least not yet. This was a warning, a mental torture tactic. They wanted me to imagine the worst-case scenarios so I would surrender quickly. But I understood how organized crime worked. If I called Kendra right now, her panic would spread to me, and my panic would be exactly what they wanted to see. I couldn't show them that I was bleeding. I had to show them an impenetrable wall. For 40 years, I had faced the most ruthless enemies in the business world, men who used every dirty trick imaginable to crush me. The only reason I survived was because I never negotiated with extortionists. When you take a single step back in response to a threat, you don't save your loved ones. You teach your enemy that their method works. If I signed Donovan's transfer papers, the Miami syndicate would get their money. But what would happen afterward? They would never release Kendra. She would become the perfect tool to manipulate me forever. The only way to protect Kendra was not to kneel and beg. The only way was to cut off the hand holding that photograph. I placed the phone on the passenger seat. I didn't reply. Silence is sometimes the most brutal response of all. It would force Donovan to question everything. It would plant doubt inside his shallow mind. He would wonder whether I cared about Kendra, whether I had called the police, whether I had another plan. My silence would begin burning away his confidence. But inside me, the machinery of war had already been activated. Protecting Kendra could not rely on campus security. It required overwhelming and invisible power. Donovan had brought jungle law into my house. He had dragged a child into a war between predators. He believed he was a cunning wolf cornering an old sheep. But he had forgotten the most basic law of nature. You never corner a lion, especially when that lion is protecting its cub. I started the engine again. The roar of the machine tore through the night. It was time for my brother-in-law to pay the price not with money, but with his freedom and possibly his life. I set the phone down on the passenger seat. The image of Kendra's tear-filled eyes burned into my mind like a scar. In moments like this, an ordinary person would immediately call the police. They would dial a federal hotline or hire armed security teams to surround the Stanford campus. But that is how people react when they do not understand real power or how the underworld actually works. When you call the police, you surrender control of your loved one's life to a slow, bureaucratic system that leaks information like a cracked pipe. The Miami syndicate would know within minutes if police began circling that parking lot. They might retreat today, but tomorrow they would return with harsher and more violent methods. Most importantly, the police would treat this as an extortion case and begin a long negotiation process. I do not negotiate with men who threaten my blood. I do not want them to retreat. I want them erased completely. I reached beneath the driver's seat. The floor lining slid aside, revealing a hidden compartment concealed beneath the carpet. Inside was a heavily encrypted satellite phone, completely disconnected from any telecommunications towers within the United States. The system could not be traced. It could not be intercepted. I dialed a long string of numbers connecting directly to a secure line in Zurich, Switzerland. It was the middle of the night in Europe, but the man on the other end always answered on the first ring. His name was Heinrich. He was not only my chief legal counsel, he was also the architect of the entire hidden financial defense system, protecting the Sterling Empire. Heinrich was a cold and precise man who treated law and money not as business tools, but as weapons of mass destruction. The line clicked. There was no unnecessary greeting, only silence. Waiting. I spoke calmly, evenly, but with the weight of a death sentence in my voice. Henrik, I said the rats have chewed through the wires and they just touched Kendra. That single sentence was enough. Heinrich understood immediately. He knew exactly what Kendra meant to me and to the future of this family. I heard him exhale slowly through the receiver. The quiet sound of a hunter calmly loading an armor-piercing round into a rifle. He spoke in his heavy European accent. To what level would you like this handled, Elias? A warning, or total elimination? I looked through the windshield at the blurred glow of Atlanta's streetlights sliding past. Donovan believed he held my granddaughter's life in his hands. He believed he could force an old, senile man to surrender an empire. He wanted to seize my investment fund, pay his $150 million debt to the Miami syndicate, and continue living his fraudulent luxury lifestyle. But if I merely stopped him, if I simply blocked him from accessing the money, he would become desperate and keep attacking my family. The only way to end this threat permanently was to give him exactly what he wanted, only it would be poisoned, deadly, irreversible. I spoke again, my voice razor cold. Activate Operation Icarus. Cut his wings. Operation Icarus was not a passive defense plan. It was a perfect trap, a fatal vulnerability Heinrich and I had designed 10 years earlier in case the Sterling family was ever attacked from within. In Greek mythology, Icarus flew too close to the sun with wings made of wax. His arrogance melted them, and he fell into the sea. Donovan was Icarus. He wanted to fly high using my money, using my power. So I would give him those wings. On the surface, the plan was simple, but underneath it was merciless. We would not stop Donovan from taking control of the Sterling Foundation. On the contrary, we would secretly divide every legitimate asset and clean financial stream of the foundation into a completely protected legal entity hidden across several European tax havens. What remained in the United States, the glamorous shell Donovan was drooling over, would be merged with the Black Seed Fund. The Black Seed Fund was a financial black hole, a shell corporation I had used quietly to absorb toxic debts, illegal contracts, and anti-money laundering violations belonging to competitors before destroying them. It was a legal minefield. Anyone foolish enough to become the legal owner of that entity and execute financial transfers through it would immediately trigger the highest level of criminal investigation by both the FBI and the IRS. Donovan was using my granddaughter's life to force me to sign over control. He believed he was about to receive a priceless treasure that would free him from his debts. But in reality, he was about to inherit a ticking bomb. The moment he used his authority as the new chairman to transfer $150 million of clean money to the Miami syndicate federal monitoring systems would automatically trigger because of the embedded flags inside the fund. The Miami criminals would receive nothing, and Donovan would instantly become the prime suspect in a massive federal money laundering operation, a crime he could never escape. Heinrich responded briefly. All systems are ready. The silent transfer will be complete in under 48 hours. Then he asked about Kendra's safety during that window. I replied calmly. When Donovan believes he has secured the foundation and forced me to sign the transfer papers, he will quickly pull his hired wolves away. He is too afraid that anything might disrupt the final transaction. His greed and arrogance will become Kendra's greatest shield. He will cherish my silence as if it were victory. I ended the call and returned the satellite phone to the hidden compartment beneath the seat. Every fatal move had now been arranged. The Miami syndicate believed they were the most dangerous predators in the game. Donovan Pierce, my worthless brother-in-law, believed he was the cleverest manipulator alive. But neither of them understood a fundamental rule of the real world. Among true apex sharks, blood is never spilled in the streets with guns or threats. Blood is spilled on contracts written quietly in the darkest rooms. I slammed my foot onto the accelerator. The engine roared as the vintage sports car tore through the cold Atlanta night. It was time to return to the mansion. Time to clean out the garbage my brother-in-law had dragged into my home. And time to prepare the greatest collapse of his life. A performance where in the final act he would lose everything. Cornered, broken, begging for a federal prison sentence just to stay alive. The punishment delivered by a father by a grandfather is never loud. It is only absolute destruction. 3 days had passed since I picked up the phone and called my attorney Heinrich in Switzerland. 3 days is not a long time in the turning of the earth, but for a man as blindly hungry for power as Donovan, it was more than enough time to reveal every filthy and ridiculous part of his nature. On Thursday morning, while I was sitting in the quiet reading room on the second floor, a roaring sound tore through the peace of the estate. The engine of a supercar screamed crudely, shredding the stillness of the morning. I stood up, leaned on my cane, and stepped onto the balcony to look down at the wide marble courtyard below. A fluorescent blue Bugatti worth nearly $3 million was slowly rolling in and came to a stop right in the middle of the drive. It was not merely parked in the wrong place. It was deliberately blocking the space reserved for my vintage cars. The doors flew open like the wings of a giant bat, and Donovan stepped out. He was dressed in a glossy, custom-made Tom Ford suit, paired with a silk shirt unbuttoned 3 buttons down to expose a thick gold chain around his neck. He slicked back his hair stiff with gel and admired the wealth he believed he had stolen through his own cleverness. His arrogance smelled like a half-burned landfill. He strutted around my house, barking at the gardeners, ordering them to clear out the fountain so he could host a party. What he did not know was that the Bugatti had not been bought with my money. When he used his forged guardianship authority to sign the financing papers for the car, he had unknowingly signed the debt under the name of the Black Seed Fund, the lethal trap I had already prepared for him. The more recklessly he spent, the heavier the federal sentence waiting for him would become. But at that moment, he was intoxicated by the illusion of victory. He wanted the whole world to know that he was the new king of Atlanta. That evening, my mansion was transformed into a cheap, depraved nightclub. Flashing lights were hastily installed all across the grounds. Bass, heavy music rattled the century-old windows. Dozens of strangers, tattooed men who carried the unmistakable look of Miami street enforcers, and women in tiny dresses clinging to anyone with money, wandered arrogantly across my late wife's priceless carpets. I did not lock myself in my room. I chose to remain present. Wearing a dark silk robe, I took my cane and walked downstairs, then sat quietly in a shadowed corner of the great living room. I wanted to witness all of it with my own eyes. I wanted the anger burning silently in my chest to become the purest possible fuel for the reversal that was coming. His audience was made up of society's refuse, people who had come only for free liquor and the chance to flatter his fake wealth. Donovan stood in the middle of the room, a glass of expensive champagne in one hand and a blonde stranger wrapped around his waist with the other. He laughed loudly and bragged about how easily he had taken over the Sterling Foundation. Then he pointed at me with open contempt and told his friends, "Look at that senile old fool. A whole lifetime of hard work, and now everything belongs to me." The crowd burst into ugly, hollow laughter. I did not respond. I simply took a sip of water, my eyes as still as a windless lake. But then the limit of my restraint was broken, not because he insulted me, but because he turned his cruelty on someone innocent. Martha had been the black housekeeper working for the Sterling family for 20 years. She was not merely an employee. She had stood beside my late wife in the kitchen, preparing warm family dinners. She had sung my granddaughter Kendra to sleep when the child cried at night. Martha carried the quiet dignity of devotion and self-respect. That night, Donovan had forced her to wear an affected maid's uniform and serve drinks to his low-class guests. Her face showed exhaustion and humiliation. She moved through the crowd, trying to slip past drunken men dancing wildly. Suddenly, one of Donovan's intoxicated friends stumbled backward and slammed into her. The tray in her hands tilted. She tried to steady it, but it was useless. A champagne glass tipped, and several drops splashed onto the toe of Donovan's expensive crocodile skin shoe. It felt as if someone had switched off the music. The whole room fell into a dead silence. Martha immediately bent low, pulled a handkerchief from her apron, and with trembling hands tried to wipe his shoe clean. She kept apologizing, her voice tight with fear. Any decent man would have helped her up and said it was nothing, just a small accident. But Donovan was not that kind of man. He needed an opportunity to demonstrate absolute power in front of the Miami syndicate watching him. He viciously kicked her hand away, sending her crashing to the floor. Then he roared in a shrill, poisonous voice. He cursed her with the vilest words he could find, dragging her race and background into the insult for the amusement of the crowd. He said she was a filthy, useless old woman who had leeched off this family for too long. Then he pulled a stack of cash from his pocket and threw it directly into her face. The dollar bills scattered across the carpet. He shouted, "You're fired! Get out of my house right now before I call security and have you thrown into the street." Martha knelt on the floor, tears running down her wrinkled cheeks. She was not crying because she had lost her job. She was crying because of the total humiliation of having her dignity crushed in the very place where she had given the best years of her life. No one in the crowd spoke up. They stood there watching an elderly woman be degraded and smiled in approval at the cruelty of their new master. At that moment, my blood began to boil. The beast inside my chest roared to tear through my ribs and crush the throat of that cowardly man. My hand tightened around the cane until the knuckles turned white. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to bring the oak cane down and crack his skull open. I wanted to show this scum what the wrath of Elias Sterling really looked like. But just as I began to rise, a cold thought cut through my mind. If I intervened now, I would be walking straight into his trap. Donovan would instantly use my reaction as proof that I was exhibiting violent, unstable behavior. He would have the excuse he needed to dump me into the isolation wing of a psychiatric facility, and the bait I had set within the Black Seed Fund would be interrupted. The Miami men standing in that room were watching everything. If I revealed my true strength now, they would grow suspicious, and Operation Icarus would collapse. Sometimes the greatest sacrifice a man can make is not rushing out to block the bullet. Sometimes it is standing still, clenching his teeth, and watching those he loves endure injustice so that he can deliver the final killing blow. I caught Martha's eye as she slowly stood and began gathering the shattered glass. I looked directly at her, not with pity, but with a silent command. I gave her the smallest nod, barely visible, just enough for the two of us to understand. An unspoken message passed between us: endure this leave with your head high, and I will repay this injustice 1,000 times over. Martha looked at me, her lips pressed tightly together. She understood. 20 years in the Sterling household had taught her exactly who I was. She straightened her back, left the broken shards where they lay, and refused to pick up the money Donovan had thrown in her face. Then she turned and walked away, her steps steady and dignified, leaving the mansion glowing under the ghostly lights of the depraved party. Donovan laughed triumphantly, raised his glass into the air, and shouted, "Let's keep this party going!" The music erupted again. He was standing at the peak of his arrogance. He believed he had removed a thorn from his side. He believed he had crushed the final resistance within this house. He was so intoxicated by his counterfeit power that he did not realize the noose around his neck was tightening with every passing minute. He had just driven away the only person in that house who might have reminded him of moral limits. Now he was completely isolated inside the blindness of his own greed. I sat there in the dark and poured myself another glass of water. Enjoy it while you can, Donovan, I thought. Drink every drop of champagne bought with dirty money. Enjoy the sensation of being king, because this will be the last party of your life as a free man. Every drumbeat in that music, every sneering laugh that leaves your mouth is another nail being driven into the darkest coffin of federal prison. The bomb had already been activated, and the countdown was underway. The bass from the living room pounded through the house, rattling even the oil paintings on the walls. Yet it could not break the suffocating tension in the hallway. I remained seated quietly in the corner, watching the grotesque spectacle of the party. Suddenly, Donovan separated from the crowd. His face was flushed red from alcohol and the intoxication of power. He walked straight toward me. The fake smile on his lips had disappeared, replaced by the cold cruelty of a man whose patience had run out. He bent down, grabbed my arm with brutal force, and yanked me to my feet. Through clenched teeth, he snarled, "The show's over, old man. You're coming with me right now, or I'll have my people clean up your precious granddaughter." Two large Miami thugs stepped out of the shadows behind me. Unlike Donovan, they didn't wear silk suits. They wore black shirts that revealed tattoos creeping up their necks, and they carried the sour smell of sweat mixed with cheap cigar smoke. I leaned on my cane and walked slowly, letting Donovan drag me down the hallway toward the study. The heavy oak door swung open. The moment I stepped inside, one of the men slammed it shut and twisted the brass lock. The dry click of the lock cut off the music outside. The room where I had once directed billion-dollar transactions, where priceless books and family memories were kept, had now become an interrogation chamber thick with hostility. Donovan shoved my shoulder and forced me down into my own leather chair. He walked around the mahogany desk and slammed a massive stack of documents onto it. The impact of the papers echoed heavily. It was a thick legal file nearly 200 pages long, carefully bound. Across the cover was printed in bold capital letters, "Full transfer of inheritance rights." Donovan planted both hands on the desk and leaned toward me. "I gave you 3 days to think," he said. "This is the final deadline." He pointed to the file. Every page marked with red brackets had to be signed. The moment I finished signing, he declared the entire Sterling Foundation, its subsidiaries' bank accounts, and real estate would legally transfer to him as the sole guardian. I looked down at the file, then slowly lifted my gaze to him. In a weak, trembling voice, I asked, "And if I don't sign?" Donovan let out a sharp laugh. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and lit up the screen. Kendra's photograph appeared again. My granddaughter crying in the car. He slid the phone across the desk toward me. His voice turned icy. "My friends on the West Coast are parked right next to her Mustang. One text message and she's dragged out of that car, stuffed into a trunk. No one will ever find her body in the Nevada desert." Then he added coldly, "The stubborn pride of a senile old man isn't worth a young girl's future." To reinforce the threat, one of the Miami men stepped forward. This one had a long scar running across his eyebrow. Without saying a word, he calmly pulled a black semi-automatic pistol from his waistband. He placed it on the desk beside the contract, right next to the file, right next to my gold-plated fountain pen. The heavy metal struck the wood with a chilling sound. The thug smiled, revealing gold-capped teeth, and gestured for me to pick up the pen. It was perfect psychological pressure. They wanted me to feel trapped, cornered between losing my fortune and watching my family die. Donovan crossed his arms and savored what he believed was the greatest moment of his life. He began ranting about how he had endured living in my shadow for 20 years. He said he hated the way I looked down on him. He hated the way I gave him meaningless positions in the company. Tonight he said he would finally take everything he deserved. I sat silently while his insults poured into the air. My eyes lowered to my spotted hands resting on the head of my cane. Any ordinary man in this situation would have collapsed. They would beg or sweep the papers off the table in rage. But my mind does not function through panic. It works like a quantum machine analyzing variables. Donovan was too arrogant, too confident in his plan. He had brought a 200-page contract to force my signature, never realizing that in high-level finance, the thickness of a contract is precisely where the deadliest traps are hidden. He did not know that during the past 3 days, while he was busy buying supercars and hosting drunken parties, my legal team in Switzerland had quietly infiltrated his legal structure. The documents in front of me had been altered, only slightly. Just a few crucial clauses buried deep within the appendices few people ever read. Donovan believed he was forcing me to transfer the vast, clean financial empire of the Sterling family. But in reality, he was holding his own execution order. This contract did not transfer real assets. It transferred full legal ownership of a shell entity known as the Black Seed Fund, a financial landfill filled with toxic debts, phantom contracts, and federal violations I had spent years collecting. But for the trap to close perfectly, I had to finish the performance. I had to play the defeated old man. I began breathing heavily. My breaths came uneven and strained. My trembling hand stretched toward the desk, brushing the cold surface of the pistol before slowly pulling away. Then I looked up at Donovan. My eyes widened as I forced a look of despair and surrender. In a hoarse voice, I whispered, "Please, don't hurt Kendra. I'll sign. I'll give you everything you want. Just make sure she's safe." Donovan laughed triumphantly. Greed flashed across his eyes. He grabbed my gold pen, uncapped it, and shoved it into my hand. Leaning close, his alcohol-soaked breath hit my face. "I knew you were smart, Elias," he said. "Sign it. Then I'll call my men to pull back." He flipped to the first page and pointed at the dotted line. I held the pen. The tip touched the white paper. For Donovan, this moment was the birth of his new empire. For me, it was the first stroke of the sentence that would bury him forever. The room fell silent except for the scratching sound of the pen across paper. He believed he was interrogating me. He didn't realize that he was the one voluntarily stepping onto the gallows. Page after page I signed, while inside my mind a countdown had already begun for the destruction of his entire life. The Miami gangsters watched with satisfaction, unaware they had just been pulled into a game where they were nothing more than expendable pieces. The supreme arrogance of my enemies has always been my sharpest weapon. And tonight, Donovan Pierce had sharpened that weapon to perfection. I sat slumped in my leather chair. My spine, the same spine that had once carried the weight of an enormous financial empire, now deliberately sagged like the trunk of a rotting tree. I began to gasp for breath. Each wheezing inhale rattled through my chest, like the last breaths of an old man at the edge of collapse. The hand resting on my mahogany desk trembled violently. My eyes drifted toward the bookshelf, where a silver picture frame held the photograph of Kendra smiling brightly on the day she graduated from high school. My face twisted. I forced tears to gather at the corners of my eyes, shaping an expression of pure grief and desperation. Anyone watching that moment would feel a suffocating sense of injustice. A man who had spent his entire life proud, a lion who had torn apart countless rivals in the business world, now bowing obediently before a worthless parasite and two third-rate gangsters. I was performing a flawless act, and I knew that anyone hearing this story, even you listening right now, would probably be shouting in anger. You would want me to leap to my feet. You would want me to pull a gun from a hidden drawer and put a bullet through Donovan's forehead. But surface violence is the weapon of fools who lack control. Donovan saw my tears and believed he had already won. He slammed his hand on the desk, impatiently, urging me to hurry and take the pen. What he did not realize was that behind those clouded eyes and trembling hands, my mind was locking onto its target with perfect clarity. In the natural world, the most terrifying predators are not the ones that roar the loudest. They are the monsters that lie motionless beneath the mud, pretending to be a harmless piece of driftwood until the prey wanders close enough. My spotted fingers slowly reached for the gold-plated pen. I deliberately dropped it once onto the desk to deepen the illusion of weakness. The Miami thug beside me scoffed with open contempt. Donovan sighed in triumph, picked the pen up, and shoved it firmly back into my hand. He was savoring the feeling of grinding me beneath his heel. He had bitten too deeply into the bait. He was drunk on power, so blind that he could not see the shape of the trap closing around him. I gripped the pen. The golden nib touched the white surface of the contract. I leaned forward slightly, my eyes still fixed on Kendra's photograph. "I'm doing this for her," I whispered in a broken voice. Donovan burst into laughter. The sound filled the suffocating room. The pen moved, ink touched paper, and my foolish brother-in-law had just opened the gates of hell with his own hands. The gold-plated fountain pen scratched across the white paper, producing a dry, rasping sound. In the quiet room, that sound echoed like the sharpening of death's scythe against stone. I held the pen in my wrinkled hand deliberately, letting my fingers tremble with each movement. Every stroke of my signature looked crooked and weak, like the fading life of an old man approaching his final moments. The 200-page document lay heavy on the mahogany desk. On every page marked with red brackets, I had to leave either a signature or my initials. The process was slow, painfully slow. For a man as desperate for power as Donovan, it was torture. He stood right at the edge of the desk, both hands pressed against the glass surface. His breathing was heavy and impatient. He did not blink. His eyes were fixed on the tip of my pen, the way a starving animal watches fresh meat. The air inside the study thickened with the scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the sour sweat and cigarette smoke of the 2 Miami enforcers standing behind me. The pounding music from the party outside continued vibrating through the walls. But inside Donovan's mind, the world had shrunk to nothing but those white pages and the black ink slowly locking the fate of the Sterling Empire into his hands. The thug with the long scar across his eyebrow smirked. He clicked his tongue in contempt and muttered in a heavy tropical accent. "I thought this old man was some legendary shark in Atlanta," he said. "Turns out he's just a tired old carp wagging its tail and begging for mercy." The second thug burst into a thick, ugly laugh. To them, I was nothing, just useless trash, a roadblock that had finally been kicked aside. I turned to page 150. My hand deliberately slipped, dragging the pen into a long, accidental line. I looked up at Donovan, wheezing for breath. I forced the most pleading, exhausted expression I could muster. In a broken voice, I asked whether he would truly order his men in California to withdraw once I signed the final page. I spoke Kendra's name again. My voice cracked like that of a grandfather being hollowed out from the inside. Donovan sneered. He leaned forward, flattened the page with his palm, and stabbed his finger at the signature line. "You don't get to make demands here, old man," he hissed. "Sign the damn thing. Then maybe you'll let the girl live." He slicked his gelled hair back again, savoring the power of holding life and death in his hands. He was flying high. The wax wings of arrogance were carrying him closer to the sun than ever before. He believed every signature I wrote was transferring millions of dollars, skyscrapers, and massive investment portfolios into his possession. What he didn't know was that buried inside the complex legal language of the appendices, the entity he was actually inheriting was the Black Seed Fund, a financial nuclear device. By forcing this transfer, he had just become the sole legal representative responsible for $150 million in illicit funds and transactions violating federal anti-money laundering laws. I was not handing him an empire. I was placing a striped prison uniform from a maximum security federal facility directly onto his shoulders. The velvet-lined trap had been prepared perfectly, and the little rat was happily devouring the cheese laced with the deadliest arsenic imaginable. The final page appeared. Sweat formed on my forehead, not from fear, but from the effort of suppressing the surge of exhilaration rushing through my veins. The predator inside me growled, waiting for the moment the blade would plunge into my enemy's chest. I took a deep breath. My hand trembled as I lowered the pen and completed the final signature. The instant the pen left the page, Donovan couldn't wait another second. He lunged forward like an animal grabbing prey, ripping the document from my hands so violently that the edge of the cover tore slightly. He clutched the thick file to his chest, closed his eyes, and tilted his head back toward the ceiling. He inhaled deeply. His face stretched into an expression of absolute satisfaction, the twisted pleasure of a thief who believed he had stolen a throne. Then he opened his eyes, looked at the Miami thugs, and nodded sharply. "It's done," he shouted, his voice trembling with excitement. "Everything is mine now. Tell the boss in Miami to get ready for his money. I'll release the $150 million next week." The two gangsters slapped their fists together and laughed loudly. One of them retrieved the pistol from the desk and tucked it back into his waistband. For them, the job had been completed far too easily. Donovan turned back toward me. The threats were gone from his expression now. What remained was pure contempt, the gaze of a newly crowned king looking down at a beggar. He walked around the desk and stood towering over me. With 2 fingers he brushed imaginary dust from the shoulder of my silk robe. Then he leaned down and whispered into my ear, "You know something, Elias. For 20 years, I had to bow my head and call you chairman. I had to survive on the crumbs you tossed me. But times have changed. Starting tonight, I'm the king of Atlanta, and am going to erase the name Sterling from every building in this city." I sat quietly in my chair and said nothing. I let him savor every drop of his illusion. Because I understand the mathematics of collapse. The higher you allow your enemy to climb, the more completely their bones shatter when they fall. More completely, their bones shatter when they fall. Donovan hugged the document containing his own death sentence, and turned toward the door. He flung the study door open. Blinding light and wild music from the party flooded into the room. He stepped into the hallway, raising the file high above his head and shouting a victorious roar. The crowd outside erupted in cheers, celebrating the coronation of their puppet king. I remained seated in the dark study, and for the first time in 72 years of life, I smiled the coldest smile I had ever worn. "Your party has begun, Donovan, but you don't realize yet I've already bought you a one-way ticket to hell." Donovan clutched the thick stack of documents against his chest as if it were his lifeline. He exhaled deeply, his face stretching into a crooked smile of pure satisfaction. The 2 Miami gangsters looked at each other, patted Donovan on the shoulder, and walked out of the study, leaving the new king of Atlanta alone to savor his moment of victory. Their footsteps faded down the hallway, blending with the pounding music from the party outside. Now only 2 men remained in the room. One stood at the peak of blind arrogance. The other sat quietly at the bottom of a perfectly constructed trap. Donovan slowly walked around the mahogany desk. He no longer kept his distance. He stepped close to me, staring down, with all the contempt he had suppressed for 20 years. He slipped his hand into the pocket of his tailored trousers and casually pulled out a platinum money clip. From it, he removed a crisp $100 bill and held it up in front of my face. The chandelier light reflected off the green surface of the note, making it glow with a cold sheen. He looked at the bill, then at me. The corner of his mouth curled into a cruel smile. His voice was soft, but the venom in it cut straight to the bone. "For 20 years, he said, I lived like a dog under your feet, picking up the spare change you tossed at me. But tonight, everything has changed." He released the bill. The $100 note drifted slowly through the air before landing on the handmade wool carpet at my feet. He jerked his chin toward the floor. "Pick it up." He told me to take the money call, some cheap car service, pack my things, and leave for the nursing home he had already arranged. Then he leaned closer and hissed that if he saw my face in the house the next morning, he would have his security guards throw me out like a stray dog. For any proud man, such humiliation would feel like a knife driven straight into the heart. Being thrown out of the house you built with your own hands. Having money tossed at you like a beggar. Anyone hearing this story might feel their blood boiling. You might want me to stand up and slap that smirk off his face. But I remind you again, we do not solve problems with momentary emotions. Surface anger destroys great plans. Real power is not measured by how loudly you shout when you are insulted. It is measured by how calmly you can smile when you know your enemy has already stepped into the grave. I lowered my head, continuing the role of a broken old man who had lost all will to resist. My spotted hand trembled as it slid down the armrest of the chair. Slowly, painfully, I bent forward and reached out to pick up the $100 bill from the floor. The moment my fingers touched the note, Donovan burst out laughing. A sharp, triumphant laugh filled the room. He adjusted the lapel of his silk suit, turned his back on me, and walked out without another glance. He left me sitting there in the dim study while he returned to his vulgar celebration to continue celebrating the bloody crown he believed he had stolen. When the study door slammed shut behind him, the pitiful expression on my face vanished instantly. My spine straightened. The trembling in my hands disappeared. I smoothed the $100 bill and placed it neatly on the desk. He believed that was the final humiliation, but he had no idea that this $100 note was the last piece of clean money he would ever be able to throw around freely. By tomorrow, every bank account under the Black Seed Fund he had just inherited would fall under federal surveillance. Every credit card in his wallet would soon become nothing more than useless plastic. He wanted me to pack my bags and leave. How amusing. Yes, I would leave, but not for a nursing home. I would move into a luxury penthouse in downtown Atlanta, pour myself a glass of exceptional wine, and watch this performance reach its conclusion. Donovan had already purchased his one-way ticket to hell. Tonight, I would let him enjoy the summit of his arrogance. Because when dawn arrived, when the first transfer attempts began, his world would collapse faster than a house made of playing cards. I stood up with my cane and quietly exited the study through the side door. Tonight belonged to him, but tomorrow would be my sentence. The study door slammed shut, sealing the pounding music and vulgar laughter outside. I remained alone in the familiar quiet of the mahogany room. The $100 bill Donovan had thrown onto the floor now lay neatly on the desk. I smoothed its folds with fingers that had completely stopped trembling. The performance of a confused, weak, helpless old man had officially ended. I leaned back into the leather chair, took a slow breath of the last clean air remaining in this house, and allowed the coldest smile of my 72 years to slowly form on my face. Out there, Donovan Pierce, my worthless brother-in-law, was celebrating wildly. He was raising glasses of champagne, wrapping his arms around long-legged women, and proclaiming himself the new king of Atlanta. He clutched the 200-page contract to his chest, as if it were an immeasurable treasure. He believed my crooked signatures had officially transferred the entire sterling financial empire, its massive investment portfolios, and sprawling real estate holdings into his hands. He thought that by using my granddaughter's life as bait, he had forced an old lion to kneel and surrender its crown. But arrogance is a poison that blinds reason. He was so hungry for power that he never bothered to read the fine print buried in the final appendice. If he had been intelligent enough to hire a seasoned attorney to review that contract, he would have discovered a terrifying truth. What he had seized was not the sterling foundation. 48 hours earlier, immediately after my secure call to Switzerland, my chief lawyer Heinrich and his covert legal team had worked without rest. Using the absolute authority granted to me as the sole founder, I activated a stealth asset separation protocol. Every legitimate revenue stream, every profitable subsidiary, every clean investment vehicle, every lawful trust belonging to the Sterling family had already been extracted and transferred into anonymous corporate entities hidden within European tax havens. What remained in the United States, the glamorous shell still bearing the name Sterling Foundation, the object of Donovan's greed, was nothing more than an empty corpse. And inside that corpse, I had carefully placed something waiting for its new king. The Black Seed Fund. In the underground financial world, the Black Seed Fund is not a place where life grows. It is a black hole, a radioactive landfill. For years, I had used that secret entity to collect unsalvageable debts, toxic contracts from competitors I acquired, and most importantly, records connected to international money laundering operations, evidence I kept as a defensive weapon. By forcing me to sign the inheritance transfer, Donovan had not stolen an empire. He had just voluntarily signed a document declaring himself the sole legal mastermind responsible for a shell corporation carrying $150 million in dirty money. He wanted to use my financial system to repay his debt to the Miami syndicate. He intended to move that money overseas through my banking infrastructure to wash his crimes clean. But he had no idea that the Black Seed Fund had been equipped by Heinrich and myself with a dead man financial trigger. It was designed to activate a federal trap. Any attempt to transfer money out of that entity would be immediately flagged by banking security systems, and the alert would not stop at the bank. The violation signal would automatically generate reports under the Patriot Act and the Anti-Money Laundering Act, transmitting them directly to servers operated by the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Donovan believed he was a clever hunter cornering his prey. He did not understand that in the true game of power, there is no room for amateurs who rely on muscle and cheap threats. When you want to destroy a monster, you do not stab it with a small knife. You open your door, invite it inside, prepare the grandest feast imaginable, and allow it to eat the poison it chose for itself. He believed the photograph of Kendra was a sword pressed against my throat. In truth, it was the final shovel of dirt he used to dig his own grave. My granddaughter remained safe because Donovan feared ruining the deal before the money moved. His greed would prevent him from touching her. Kendra's safety was protected by the blind hunger of the enemy himself. I picked up the gold fountain pen and placed it back into my breast pocket. Tonight, Donovan could continue drinking champagne. He could continue shouting in the delusion of his victory. I would allow him to enjoy the final, glorious hours of a free man's life. Because in only a few days, when he steps onto a luxury yacht in Miami, opens his laptop and confidently presses the button to transfer $150 million to the crime bosses waiting for their payment, everything will end. His sky will collapse. There will be no billions waiting for him. Only the scream of police sirens, the roar of federal helicopters, and the black barrels of rifles pointed straight at his head. He wanted me to walk out of this house with nothing but that $100 bill. I will keep that bill as a souvenir. A reminder of the day the dumbest brother-in-law in the world paid for his own one-way ticket to a federal maximum security prison. I rose slowly with my cane. The darkness in the room no longer felt suffocating. Every piece on the board had already been arranged. The lion had set the trap. Now the only thing left to do was pour a glass of wine and watch the prey tear itself apart in front of the crowd. 4 days passed after the night that reeked of betrayal in my study. 4 days were more than enough for the poison of arrogance to spread through Donovan's veins. He wasted not a single second displaying the illusion of power he believed he had won. On Friday morning, he flew to Miami aboard a fully chartered private jet. Miami, the city of glittering lights and crimes carefully hidden beneath layers of luxury. He wasn't going there for vacation. He went there to personally hand the executioner the rope that would hang him. Donovan spent a fortune renting a 150-foot superyacht anchored at one of the most exclusive private marinas in the bay. He called it the disbursement party, a lavish celebration marking his rise to the throne of the Sterling family, and the moment he would repay the $150 million debt owed to the crime syndicate. From where I sat, as a quiet observer, I could picture every absurd detail of that grotesque celebration through reports sent by my private intelligence network. The yacht's deck shimmered under the fading Florida sunset. Electronic music blasted so loudly it rattled the expensive teak flooring. Around Donovan swarmed dozens of hired models women paid thousands of dollars an hour. They wore tiny swimsuits and danced around him, pouring him the most expensive champagne in the world. Donovan stood at the center of it all, silk shirt open at the chest, gold chain gleaming, one hand holding a champagne glass, the other wrapped around the waist of a blonde who looked as empty as the glass she kept refilling. He laughed loudly. He shouted stories of triumph. He believed he was living the greatest moment of his life. He believed he was a genius manipulator, the man who outsmarted the old lion of Atlanta and seized an entire financial empire with a few careless signatures. But beneath that ridiculous party scene hung an atmosphere thick with death. At the far end of the deck sat a group of men who had no interest in the music. They wore dark shirts that revealed the tattoos of South American crime syndicates, professional money launderers, cold-blooded enforcers of Miami's underworld. At their center sat Hector, a man with a sharp, angular face and eyes as cold as a reptile's. Hector wasn't drinking champagne. He held only a glass of water. His gaze remained locked on Donovan's every movement, like a snake watching a rat dance. Donovan swaggered over and slapped Hector on the shoulder with the arrogance of a newly crowned king. He shouted over the music, "Relax, my friend. Tonight all debts disappear. Tonight we begin a new era together." Hector didn't smile. He shoved Donovan's hand off his shoulder. Then he leaned forward slowly, his voice low and heavy with threat. "I didn't come here to watch these women shake their asses," Hector said. "And I don't care about your new era. You promised $150 million before sunset. So where's my money?" The coldness in Hector's voice made Donovan hesitate for a brief moment. The smile on his face flickered, but arrogance quickly returned. Greed and pride had blinded him completely. He snapped his fingers and signaled for his assistant. A small glass table was placed in front of him along with an encrypted laptop. Donovan set down his champagne. He slicked back his hair and opened the computer. Then he announced loudly to the criminals gathered there, "Watch closely and learn how I took the entire sterling foundation away from that senile old man." He began logging into the system. Passwords, retina scan, access granted. He was now entering the core of the Black Seed Fund, the perfect trap I had prepared. What Donovan didn't know was that behind the familiar banking interface on his screen was a federal surveillance system. Every command he typed, every number he entered, every field he filled, all of it was being transmitted directly to secure servers operated by the IRS and the FBI. He was personally completing the indictment against himself. He believed he was a king. But the real king sat quietly in a penthouse apartment in downtown Atlanta, sipping a glass of red wine, counting down the seconds until his empire collapsed. The sense of power swelling inside Donovan, the thrill of seeing hundreds of millions displayed on the screen, blinded him completely. He turned to Hector and smirked with triumph. $150 million, he said proudly. Clean money. Transferred right now to wash away your little problems. His finger hovered over the transfer key. Around him, the models screamed with excitement. Music thundered across the deck. The Miami sun dipped slowly below the horizon, painting the ocean blood red. Can you imagine that moment? The moment a traitor believes he has won forever. The moment his arrogance reaches its highest peak seconds before it is crushed into dust. Donovan forced me to sign. He humiliated my loyal housekeeper. He threatened my granddaughter. He believed himself the greatest predator alive. But he never realized something very simple. This luxury yacht was not his palace. It was a steel cage hanging above a volcano, and the moment his finger pressed that key, everything would explode. The fuse had already been lit, and the price of betrayal was about to be paid with total destruction. The Miami sun was slowly sinking into the ocean, staining the sky a deep crimson, almost the color of blood. On the deck of the multi-million-dollar superyacht, electronic music still roared across the water. But at the curved white leather seating area at the stern, everything seemed frozen. All eyes were fixed on the laptop, glowing brightly on the glass table. Donovan Pierce, my arrogant brother-in-law, stood there with his finger hovering above the keyboard. He inhaled deeply, savoring what he believed was the greatest moment of his life. The moment he would officially purchase his freedom and earn the respect of the underworld using the fortune he believed he had stolen from me. Hector, the hardened money-laundering boss of the Miami syndicate, leaned slightly forward. His cold eyes remained locked on the screen without blinking. He had no interest in the dancing models or the expensive champagne. He cared about only one thing, the 11-digit number that had to reach a Cayman Islands account before the day ended. Donovan glanced at Hector and smirked with arrogant superiority. He wanted these criminals to witness the power of a man who controlled an investment empire. He reached forward and pulled the biometric retinal scanner toward himself. A green beam swept across his eye. A dry electronic beep confirmed maximum access authorization. The laptop screen shifted to the international transfer interface. Donovan moved the cursor calmly and entered the amount. $150 million. This was not pocket change. This was power enough to buy islands. He confidently entered the routing code of the offshore bank. He turned and winked at one of the blonde models nearby before focusing back on the enter key. What Donovan did not know was that the banking interface he was seeing had nothing to do with the Sterling Foundation. It was the internal gateway of the Black Seed Fund, the legal black hole Heinrich and I had constructed days earlier. He was standing on a minefield, and his finger was the hammer about to strike the detonator. Donovan laughed loudly. "Watch carefully, Hector," he shouted. "Your money is ready." Then he pressed the transfer key. A soft click echoed across the silent corner of the deck. But in that moment, it sounded like the safety pin of a grenade being pulled. The loading circle began spinning on the screen. 1 second. 2 seconds. Donovan tapped his shoe impatiently on the teak deck, waiting for the familiar green words, "Transaction successful." He already had a joke prepared for the celebration. Another bottle of champagne ready to be opened. But suddenly the spinning circle stopped. The screen did not flash green. It turned bright red. A massive warning window exploded across the display like an alarm siren. Bold capital letters slammed into Donovan's eyes, freezing the smile on his face instantly. Transaction frozen under the Patriot Act. Below it, a cascade of error codes began flashing. The account had been flagged on a federal blacklist. Everything happened too quickly for Donovan's brain to process. He blinked repeatedly. He stepped back. His mouth muttered meaningless sounds. He rubbed his eyes, convinced the yacht's network connection had malfunctioned. He lunged forward, hammering the keyboard, trying to reload the page, trying to cancel the transaction. But the keyboard had already been locked. The $1,000 laptop had turned into a digital gravestone engraved with his sentence. Let me explain what truly happened. By forcing me to sign the inheritance transfer that night, Donovan had unknowingly made himself the sole legal owner of the Black Seed Fund. That entity contained a web of phantom transactions tied to international laundering networks, traps I had quietly built over years. The moment he scanned his retina and attempted to transfer $150 million overseas, the algorithm detected the action as a high-level illegal asset transfer. His mouse click didn't send money to Miami. It ignited a chain reaction. The instant the screen turned red, the system automatically encrypted and transmitted the yacht's geographic coordinates, the system's device identifiers, Donovan's retinal biometric scan, a digital copy of the transfer contract. All of it was sent directly to the central servers of the FBI and the IRS. Donovan Pierce had just proven personally and voluntarily that he was the mastermind behind a massive financial crime network. He had committed legal suicide without me firing a single bullet. Panic spread through his body like poison. Cold sweat poured down his face and soaked the collar of his silk shirt. He began breathing like a drowning man. He turned toward Hector, forcing a crooked smile. "There's just a network error," he stammered. "I'll call the bank right now. Your money isn't going anywhere." "Just relax," but Hector was no fool. He had lived long enough in the underworld to recognize the scent of a federal trap. Hector slowly stood up. His calmness was far more terrifying than rage. His men rose as well, hands sliding inside their jackets toward concealed black pistols. Hector stepped forward and stared at the red warning message on the screen. Patriot Act. To international crime syndicates, those two words meant something very clear: assets seized, investigations launched, targets marked. The Miami syndicate had just lost $150 million. Worse, every one of them had now been flagged by federal authorities. Hector slowly turned toward Donovan. His eyes were empty, emotionless. He reached forward and grabbed Donovan by the throat with one massive hand. Then he lifted him off the deck. Donovan clawed desperately at Hector's arm as his face turned purple. A champagne glass crashed onto the floor, shattering into glittering fragments. Golden liquid spilled across the deck. The models screamed and backed away toward the railing. The electronic music continued pounding, indifferent to the violence unfolding. Hundreds of miles away in a penthouse apartment in Atlanta, I sat calmly with a glass of fine wine, enjoying the silence of victory. I didn't need to see the scene to know exactly how it was unfolding. Donovan wanted to be a ruthless predator. He threatened my granddaughter. He threw me out of my own home. He threw money in my face. He believed power meant shouting louder and spending more. But he forgot the oldest lesson of the elite. True power operates silently, invisible, and leaves no fingerprints. Donovan had flown too close to the sun on wings made of arrogance. Now those wings had melted. He was falling. Below him waited two things: the sharks of Miami and the inescapable legal net of the United States government. The bomb had detonated, and the earthquake it unleashed would crush Donovan Pierce completely, leaving not a single piece of him behind. Hector's massive hand tightened around Donovan's throat, lifting him completely off the expensive teak deck. The color in my brother-in-law's face changed rapidly, from the flushed red of drunken excitement to the dark purple of suffocation. The laptop screen continued flashing its bright red warning message, casting eerie light across both of their faces. Around them, the hired models began screaming and retreating toward the far corners of the yacht's deck. The electronic music still pounded with indifferent bass, but it could no longer hide the deadly tension gripping the stern of the vessel. Hector didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His eyes said everything. He was staring at a man who had not only failed to pay his debt, but had just dragged the entire Miami syndicate into the crosshairs of federal law enforcement. Just as Donovan was beginning to lose consciousness in Hector's grip, another sound rolled across the horizon. At first it was only a low rumble blending with the ocean and the fading music. But within seconds the noise grew louder, tearing through the air. This was not the sound of tourist helicopters. It was the heavy rhythmic thunder of military-grade rotor blades slicing through the sky. The DJ's speakers suddenly died. Someone had panicked and yanked the power cables. The atmosphere on the luxury yacht now held only two sounds: terrified screaming, and the roar of death descending from the sky. The salty ocean air mixed with the sharp smell of aviation fuel. Out of the gray Miami dusk, three matte black FBI stealth helicopters burst through the clouds and raced straight toward the yacht. At the same moment, from three directions across the water, armored Coast Guard intercept boats surged forward at terrifying speed. White walls of spray exploded behind them. Floodlights ignited all at once. Blinding beams from helicopters and patrol vessels blasted across the deck, turning the luxury yacht into a brightly illuminated stage of justice. Any rat hiding aboard that ship had nowhere left to run. Then a thunderous voice erupted from the loudspeaker of the lead helicopter, crushing every other sound below. This is the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation Anti-Money Laundering Task Force. All individuals on board immediately lie face down on the deck with your hand behind your head. Do not resist. Anyone who reaches for a weapon will be neutralized immediately. The words struck Donovan like a life sentence pronounced on the spot. He had scanned his retina and executed the transfer less than 3 minutes earlier. Now the entire national security apparatus had arrived to arrest him. At that moment, he finally understood the elegance and brutality of the trap I had built. He thought he controlled the game. In truth, he had been nothing more than a puppet from the very beginning. Hector released his grip and threw Donovan violently onto the deck. Donovan crashed shoulder first into the wood, gasping in panic. Hector looked up at the helicopters circling overhead, then back down at the red Patriot Act warning on the laptop screen. A shock ran down the spine of the seasoned crime boss. He understood instantly. Donovan hadn't just failed to deliver the money. The idiot had signed ownership of a legal landfill corporation filled with financial crimes and then attempted to transfer funds to the syndicate through it. That single act had turned every Miami gang member present on that yacht into co-conspirators in a federal money laundering operation, caught in real time. Donovan had handed them directly to the FBI. Hector's anger exploded beyond control. In the underworld, there is no mercy for men who betray their own and bring the police to the door. Hector ripped a semi-automatic pistol from inside his jacket. Click. The slide snapped into place. He aimed the black barrel directly at Donovan's forehead. 4 of Hector's men drew their own weapons instantly, surrounding my terrified brother-in-law. They did not point their guns skyward to fight the federal agents. That would be suicide. Instead, every single gun was aimed at Donovan, the man who had lied to them, the man who had dragged them into a trap they could never escape. They were ready to blow his head apart before the agents could even reach the deck. Donovan Pierce, the so-called new king of Atlanta, the man who minutes earlier had declared he would erase the sterling name from the city. Now he lay curled on the deck like a rag. He looked at the guns pointed at his head, then at the sniper rifles aimed down from the helicopters above. He was trapped between the 2 most ruthless forces in America: the law and the underworld. Pure terror shattered what little courage remained in him. Under the blinding floodlights, everyone could see the dark stain spreading across his expensive, tailored trousers. He had wet himself in fear. Crying uncontrollably, he clasped his hands together and begged Hector not to shoot. Through sobs, he screamed my name. He shouted that Elias had tricked him, that the old man had deceived them all. But his voice was swallowed by the thunder of helicopter blades and crashing waves. No one cared about the excuses of a man already destined for federal prison. He wanted to play in the league of powerful men. but he brought the mind of a greedy amateur. He believed bribing a doctor and forging documents was enough to steal an empire. What he never understood was that building and protecting an empire required designing the most ruthless systems of destruction imaginable. The sky above Miami did not collapse that night. Only the sky above Donovan Pierce collapsed, crushing his career, his freedom, and his entire life. The play had reached its final act, and the rat was now fully trapped inside the velvet-lined cage. The blinding lights from the FBI helicopters turned the million-dollar yacht's deck into a stage of betrayal and collapse. Rotor wash from the helicopters blasted across the deck, sending expensive champagne glasses flying and driving the hired models screaming into the corners. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents stormed aboard from high-speed intercept boats, sealing every possible escape route. Shouts of, "Get down on the deck, hands behind your head," echoed repeatedly, crushing what remained of the electronic music. Hector, the Miami syndicate boss, coldly dropped Donovan onto the teak floor, as if discarding a piece of trash. Even the most hardened criminals know when resistance means suicide. Facing federal rifles, the gang members slowly placed their weapons on the deck and raised their hands. But Donovan was different. He didn't have the composure of a real criminal. He was only a cowardly opportunist, watching his entire illusion collapse. Donovan collapsed onto his knees on the wet deck, soaked with seawater and spilled champagne. His body trembled violently, like a dog trapped in a blizzard. He stared up at the black barrels of federal rifles pointed directly at his head. In that moment, his shallow mind began spinning, desperately, searching for escape. He couldn't accept the reality of spending the rest of his life in a maximum security prison. He needed a scapegoat, someone to blame for everything. His frantic eyes darted across the deck until they stopped on the young woman crouched behind the bar. His mistress. The same woman who had helped him bribe the doctor and falsify the medical records used to freeze my accounts. Like a cornered animal, Donovan suddenly lunged to his feet. Ignoring the agent's shouted warnings, he rushed toward her. His hand came crashing across her face. The slap was so violent that she collapsed onto the floor, blood appearing at the corner of her mouth. Donovan pointed at her and screamed hysterically. He shouted to the federal agents that she was the mastermind. He swore she had manipulated him, that she had forged the medical documents, that she had orchestrated the entire scheme to steal his brother-in-law's wealth. He sobbed that he was only a victim, that he knew nothing about any money laundering operation, that everything had been driven by the greed of this woman. The cowardice was breathtaking. He was willing to sacrifice the woman who had shared his bed, hoping to earn even a sliver of mercy from the law. But Donovan had forgotten a fundamental rule of the world of deception. No one remains loyal to a traitor. The mistress clutched her swelling cheek. The fear in her eyes slowly transformed into pure fury. She was no obedient doll to be discarded when things went wrong. She knew Donovan too well, and she had prepared an insurance policy of her own. She staggered to her feet, ignoring the guns surrounding her. She spat blood onto the deck. Then she glared directly at Donovan. "You think you can make me the fall guy, you coward?" she shouted. Her shaking hand reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a smartphone. With frantic movements, she opened an audio file. Then she did something even more dramatic. She connected the phone to the yacht's powerful Bluetooth speaker system, the one the DJ had abandoned moments earlier. Donovan's voice exploded across the deck. The recording had been made in a hotel room 2 days earlier. In it, Donovan could be heard laughing while explaining his perfect plan. He bragged that once he transferred the money to the Miami syndicate, he would anonymously tip off the FBI. He planned to betray Hector and the entire laundering network. In exchange, he expected federal immunity, and he would keep the remaining funds of the Sterling Empire for himself. Every word was crystal clear. Every sentence exposed his greed and treachery. The air on the deck turned to ice. Hector, still kneeling with his hands behind his head, slowly turned toward Donovan. There was no ordinary anger in his eyes anymore, only pure killing intent. The Miami men now understood the full truth. They hadn't only been cheated out of $150 million. They had been selected as sacrificial lambs for Donovan's personal deal with federal authorities. Donovan stood frozen. His face had drained completely white. The recording had just become two things at once: evidence for the FBI and a death sentence issued by the underworld. He suddenly lunged toward the mistress, trying to silence the recording. But two federal agents tackled him and slammed him onto the deck. He thrashed and screamed hysterically, hurling obscene insults at her. The woman fought back just as viciously. She kicked him in the ribs with her sharp high heels, clawing at him and screaming that he would rot in prison. The scene became grotesque. Two traitors tearing each other apart in front of federal agents and crime bosses alike. A pathetic, humiliating spectacle. They destroyed each other. Every glamorous mask was ripped away, revealing the cowardice underneath. Donovan Pierce had dreamed of ultimate power. In the end, the only things he gained were cold steel handcuffs around his wrists and the silent promise of retribution from the Miami syndicate, waiting somewhere inside the prison system. Karma never arrives late. It only waits until the enemy reaches the highest peak before pushing them into the deepest abyss. From a distance, I watched his collapse unfold, and I knew that justice had been carried out perfectly, without a single drop of blood from the Sterling family. Less than a mile from where the superyacht was anchored, a luxury hotel tower rose into the Miami night sky. I stood on the balcony of the most expensive penthouse suite at the very top. The ocean wind carried the salty scent of the sea and fluttered the hem of my silk coat. In my hand was a glass of fine bourbon amber liquid, shimmering softly beneath the dim lights. From this height, I could see the entire harbor. I didn't even need binoculars. The blinding beams from Federal Task Force helicopters had illuminated the entire area like daylight. Down there, a play was unfolding. I was its director, yet I had no need to stand on the stage to receive applause. Tiny black figures moved chaotically across the teak deck of the yacht. I could almost picture Donovan's face. Pale, terrified. Just hours earlier, my pathetic brother-in-law had been pounding his chest and declaring himself the new king of Atlanta. He believed that 200-page contract was his crown. He never realized it was actually the death certificate of his freedom. Red and blue lights from Coast Guard patrol vessels reflected across the water, creating a strangely beautiful portrait of justice. Two large agents in body armor dragged a limp figure down the yacht's boarding ramp. That figure was Donovan. His expensive silk suit was now wrinkled, stained, and soaked in humiliation. His hands were twisted behind his back in cold steel handcuffs. He struggled helplessly, his head jerking back again and again, as if searching for a salvation that no longer existed. Members of the Miami syndicate were being escorted off one by one into armored transport vehicles. They would have plenty of time inside federal maximum security prisons to question Donovan about the $150 million that never arrived. For the rest of his life, he would live with the quiet terror that one day those men would collect their debt. I slowly rotated the glass of bourbon in my hand, feeling the warmth of it through the thin crystal. Power is not shouting in your enemy's face. Power is not throwing punches or showing off sports cars bought with borrowed money. True power is silence. It is the ability to smile politely at your enemy's, hand them a rope, and patiently watched them place the noose around their own neck. Donovan used my granddaughter's life to threaten me. He threw $100 bill in my face and forced me out of the home my late wife and I built with blood and sweat. He thought I was an old lion whose claws had grown dull, a creature waiting quietly for death. But he forgot something about the wild. The oldest lion is often the most cunning. It doesn't need claws to kill a rat. It only needs the perfect trap and the patience of stone. I gave Donovan 4 glorious days, 4 days to taste the intoxication of absolute power, 4 days to climb to the peak of his arrogance. And once he floated high among the clouds, I simply cut away his wings of wax. His fall was not only the loss of freedom, it was the destruction of his dignity, his reputation, and every illusion he ever believed in. For the rest of his life, he will know one truth: his own greed buried him. The helicopter carrying Donovan slowly lifted into the air, rotor blades tearing through the quiet Miami night. Its spotlight swept across my building one final time before disappearing into the black clouds. The purge was finished. Not a single drop of sterling blood had been spilled. Not a single clean dollar of my empire had been touched. My empire still stood solid as an unbreakable fortress. The rats had been cleared out. My house was peaceful again. My granddaughter Kendra remained safe. Her future would continue shining exactly as it should. I raised the bourbon to my lips and took a slow sip. The burn spread warmly down my throat, carrying with it the smooth sweetness of absolute victory. I looked out across the vast ocean one last time and breathed deeply. Then I turned, walked back inside, and drew the heavy velvet curtains closed, leaving the chaos of the harbor behind. Tonight I would sleep deeply, and tomorrow the sun would rise again over Atlanta. The throne had been cleared of filth, and the Sterling family would move forward stronger than ever. The next morning, brilliant sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of the Atlanta mansion. The roar of the ridiculous supercar that had been parked arrogantly across my lawn was gone. The blaring electronic music had vanished. So had the crude laughter of the low-level criminals Donovan had filled my home with. The security men he hired had quietly packed their things and disappeared during the night as soon as the morning news reported that their employer had been arrested by federal authorities. My house, the fortress Sarah and I spent a lifetime building, had finally been returned to the silence and dignity it deserved. I walked slowly across the oak floor, the steady tap of my cane echoing calmly through the halls. I headed directly toward the study. Only days earlier, Donovan's men had thrown my wife's keepsakes into trash bags there. That same night, I had personally retrieved every photograph, every letter, smoothing them carefully before storing them away again. Now I approached the marble fireplace holding our wedding photograph. The broken glass frame had already been replaced with polished mahogany. In the picture, Sarah smiled bright and gentle, the smile that once lit the life of a rigid, stubborn man like me. I carefully placed the photograph back in its rightful position at the center of the mantel. My hand rested lightly against the glass. I nodded softly toward her image. "Everything's all right now, Sarah," I whispered. "Our throne is still safe. No one will ever stain this family's legacy again." At that moment, the crunch of tires on gravel echoed from the driveway beyond the trees. I turned and walked toward the front hall. The door burst open. Kendra rushed inside like a storm. My granddaughter was still wearing her university varsity jacket. Her face looked exhausted from a rushed overnight flight from California, but her eyes shone with immense relief. The Miami gang members who had been watching her vanished from the campus parking lot the moment news broke that their boss had been arrested on the yacht. She was completely safe. Not a scratch on her. Kendra ran across the hall, dropping her backpack onto the floor before throwing her arms around me. She held onto me tightly, tears soaking through my jacket. "Grandpa," she sobbed, her voice trembling with all the fear she had held inside for days. I wrapped one arm around her shoulders and gently patted the back of her head. I didn't tell her about the lethal contracts, about the laundering accounts, about the guns drawn on that yacht in Miami. Instead, I smiled the warmest smile a grandfather could offer. "I'm here," I told her softly. "It's over. No one can hurt you anymore." Standing there, in the sunlit hall of the mansion, holding my granddaughter safely in my arms, I finally understood something with absolute clarity. Every moment of patience, every cold calculation, every ruthless decision I had made had been worth it. Because family is the one thing in this world worth becoming a monster to protect. 3 months after the fateful night on the superyacht in Miami, the federal trial concluded with astonishing speed. No prestigious attorney was willing to defend a man who had so blatantly violated federal law. The evidence retrieved from the central servers of the shell organization, combined with the incriminating recording provided by his own mistress, became iron nails sealing the legal coffin of Donovan Pierce. He stood before the court in a pitiful state. The hair that had once been slicked back with expensive gel now hung messy and lifeless. His eyes, once full of arrogance when he strutted around in silk suits proclaiming himself the new king of Atlanta, were now empty. Not even a trace of that pride remained. The federal judge looked down at him coldly. Then the gavel struck the bench with a sharp crack. The sentence was delivered clearly and without hesitation. 25 years in a federal maximum security prison. No possibility of parole. The moment Donovan heard the sentence, he collapsed. His legs buckled beneath him. He began crying and screaming, begging for mercy. He pleaded to become a cooperating witness against the criminal underworld in exchange for protection. But the system has no patience for cowardice from the architects of crime. 2 security officers dragged him out of the courtroom in utter humiliation. Yet the federal sentence was not the worst fate awaiting my brother-in-law. The thing that truly made Donovan tremble in his cold prison cell was the identity of the men around him. The Miami syndicate, the same men he had cheated out of $150 million and betrayed to federal authorities, had also been convicted. They were transferred into the same federal prison system as Donovan. Hector and his hardened men were already waiting for the day Donovan would step into the shared prison yard. In the underworld, there is no forgiveness, no apologies. Only accounts that must be settled. Donovan believed he could step over my family to climb to the top. What he never realized was that he had purchased a one-way ticket to the darkest level of hell. A place where the beasts he awakened with his betrayal were already waiting, jaws open. I sat once again in the familiar leather chair in my study, the place where all the storms had begun. The fire in the marble fireplace crackled softly, casting warm light across my face and driving away the cold that had lingered through those difficult days. The glass in my hand was empty now, but the aftertaste of justice remained vivid and unmistakable. Outside, the world continued turning as it always does. But in my world, order had been restored completely. People often preach hollow moral lessons about family. They say family must be forgiven unconditionally. They say the blood that runs through our veins is a sacred bond that should never be broken, no matter how terrible the other person becomes. But after 72 years of tasting every bitterness and sweetness life has to offer, and after personally cleaning up the cruelest betrayal from my own brother-in-law, I have learned a far harsher truth. Blood is merely a coincidence of biology. It costs nothing, and it guarantees absolutely nothing about a person's character. Loyalty, respect, and genuine love, those are the things that truly build a family. When you close your eyes to the endless greed of parasites hiding behind the mask of relatives, you are not protecting your home. You are feeding wolves inside your living room, waiting for the day they tear out your throat. The patience of a grown man, of a father, of a grandfather, is often mistaken by shallow people as weakness, submission, or the confusion of old age. What they fail to understand is that behind that calm silence is a razor-sharp mind calculating every move needed to defend its kingdom. Never mistake a man's patience for weakness. A lion may lie quietly in the grass with its eyes closed, but it never sleeps when its territory and its cubs are under threat. The play has now reached its final curtain. Donovan is paying for his arrogance and stupidity behind the cold, concrete walls of a federal prison. And the Sterling family still stands unyielding like an impregnable fortress. So tell me this. Do you agree that an old lion is still a lion? The fur may turn silver, the walk may slow, a cane may become necessary, but the claws of justice and power never grow dull. If this story made the blood in your veins surge, if you felt the satisfaction of justice being served, then smash the like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Have you ever had to use a velvet-covered iron hand to protect the people you love? Have you ever had to remove a toxic person from your own family? Share your story in the comments below. I want to read the stories of real men who fought to defend their homes, and I'll see you again in the next battle.